Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next episode of Common Ground. As always, I'm your co-host, Deb Ryan, and I'm joined by Teresa Hartmann. How are you, Teresa?
Hi, everybody. Great to be here. I'm good. How are you doing, Deb?
I'm doing well. We're actually filming some stuff back to back today because there's a lot going on in the world. We want to talk
So
in this
many things happening in
so
climate
many
world.
things. We're going to talk about all things shipping. The International Maritime Organization recently had a meeting. Didn't quite go, I think, as folks had planned, to say the least. So we want to kind of break down like what was the IMO, the International Maritime Organization, trying to do? Why did it break down? Where were some of the gaps in what they were trying to do? And like maybe what is like some of the implications more broadly as well with it sort of falling apart. So
Yeah.
um there's been a lot. So I don't know
Like,
where to
what's going to
start.
happen next? What just happened and what's going to happen next and what does it all mean?
Yeah.
Let's go.
So I guess high level, like the IMO has been talking about, how to, and for those that aren't familiar, so the International Maritime Organization is essentially international group that oversees international shipping. So it really has the ability to impact global, like it has the ability to impact kind of global perspective because it's around how do we move things between countries, and not just within countries. And so in terms of the ability for the IMO to actually impact emissions, which is what we're going to talk about, what they had done for their net zero framework, it's I'm actually quite bullish on the fact that even though global shipping is only 3% of total emissions, it actually has the ability to then ripple and have ripple effects into then what countries are doing around transport more broadly. So I'm actually a little bit disappointed that the negotiations broke down. There's lots of reasons why, and we'll sort of unpack that. But I'm kind of curious as your high level thoughts, Teresa, of like sort of what the IMO has been looking at doing around emission reduction for the last few years, actually, as
Yeah.
well.
Yeah. No, so like I think the first point to start with is that international shipping is incredibly hard to regulate because it occurs on international waters, right? So it's
Yeah.
not anybody's sovereign territory where they can just implement an emissions standard or they can legislate or they can slap on a carbon tax. It's international waters. So that's why the IMO is really, really important, because member states in general have then been very supportive to create legally binding frameworks coming out of the IMO discussions, right? So this is actually incredibly critical to understand is that there's two problems with shipping. Like one is the inability for any country to regulate unilaterally, right? Like the EU to a certain extent has, but that skews the playing field, and we'll talk about what the EU has done. The other problem with shipping is, and I think that's where you were going earlier, is that it's a harder to repeat sector, right? So like it's a place where there's not a lot of margin to invest in innovation. There are very few alternatives to actually bring down emissions from shipping. It's obviously an industry that we rely on globally, right? So like I saw something like we're moving like 2 trillion in goods through international waters. Like 80% of everything that we trade in the world is put on a ship. Right? So, like,
Yeah.
it's such an integral part of our trade system, and we have so few technologies or solutions, and we can talk about, like, different fuel types, but there's so few solutions to actually bring down emissions from shipping, right? So, like, I mean, likewise, I guess what I'm trying to say is, like, I'm equally very disappointed this broke down. I'm surprised this broke down, right? Like, there was generally coming in, there was an understanding that this was gonna get rubber stamped in October. So the proposal, and we should unpack it, but the proposal was actually negotiated. The text was agreed in April, and this was just the like top
This was supposed
level
to
moment of
be
approval.
yeah,
It
this was
wasn't
supposed to
meant
be
to
the
be
rubber
a
stamp.
negotiation meeting. It was meant to be an approval meeting.
Yeah.
But so yeah, incredibly disappointed. It all fell apart. Because of the US, we should just come out and say it.
Yep.
Um, but Deb, let's talk a little bit
Unfortunately.
about what was in the proposal, and then we can talk a little bit about what happened in the room.
Yeah. So
What was in there?
essentially Yeah, so essentially the IMO, and like I said, like they've been working on sort of climate policy going back to about 2018. But this was really around setting up their net zero framework. Which again, like we said, the framework itself was agreed back in April this year, so in 2025. And there was sort of three pieces around the net zero framework. There was one around fuel intensity and like intensity targets, both in terms of well to
What does that
tank.
mean?
So
Let's unpack an
yeah, so
intensity
sort of
target.
So there's two pieces of the intensity target that they've been looking at. One is what they call well to tank, which is broadly a term around like well, sort of meaning an oil and gas well, because usually, obviously, we're talking about petroleum based fuels, but that's sort of
So
now
the
more
question
broadly
is, how
around.
much energy does it take to get the petrol out of the ground?
Yeah, so it looks at okay, and I say and it's more broadly now used for just all like the supply chain of fuels. So as we look at other types of fuels, whether it's biofuels or methanol and stuff like that, it's essentially how do we think about the supply chain of and the emissions associated with delivering that fuel from, you know, its original production source, refining it, getting it into the tank of the ship, and what's the carbon intensity of that product, and how do we think about that?
So what
And how
would
do we
be a higher
calculate that and
intensity
what is that?
versus a lower intensity fuel in terms of production?
Yeah, so it's actually that's actually it's a very I know
Impossible to answer.
ultimately, fossil-based fuels tend to have a higher emission carbon intensity profile than like biofuels and other kind of things. But within those different spectrums, so when we look at the oil and gas industry,
Yeah.
the type of production matters. You have different types of crude that get produced. Gas is produced with alongside oil. Sometimes gas is produced on its own. So there's a huge spectrum of carbon intensity depending on the different type of essentially feedstock for fuel, whether it's a heavy oil, a lighter oil, a gas. And then when we start to look at biofuels, depending on something, if something's coming from grain, so if you're talking about like corn-based ethanol versus biofuels coming from things like used cooking oils and stuff like that, like they also have different carbon intensity profiles as well because of so you've got to kind of broadly think about it in terms of like what's the feedstock going into the fuel, how is that fuel then refined, and then how is that delivered essentially to the ship. So we have to that's why we have to look at the whole supply chain when we think about fuel carbon intensity. So that's kind of one piece of it. The other piece around the intensity framework then is the piece that's called tank to wake, which is once the fuel is in the ship and the ship is now going somewhere, how do we think about how the ship is actually burning that fuel, which really comes
And the
down
wake
to,
presumably is the wake of a ship, like the
yep,
wave behind the ship.
exactly. From essentially like we filled up the ship, we loaded it in a port, and we then sailed that ship
You
to a
went
different
somewhere.
port.
Yeah.
We went somewhere. And so that bit really kind of talks about like what is the efficiency of the ship itself? Again, the kind of, pumps, how new is that ship? And what fuel are those engines and stuff burning on that voyage as we go through it. So the intensity piece is sort of both pieces. It's the fuel and then it's the actual ship itself. So that's kind of the first piece around how this net zero kind of framework's being thought about for different ships. And then the there's a pricing system that's also part of this net zero and then a fund. And the pricing system then is essentially saying, okay, we're going to put emission intensity sort of benchmarks in place, like you would a cap and trade. And for people that exceed, or for ships and companies that exceed limits, they're going to have to pay to do that. And that money would go into the fund essentially. And for the people that then have a limit and they can through using, again, even better fuels or having a more efficient ship, can be under their cap, their intensity cap, they can like generate credits for other people to buy and stuff like that. So it sort of starts to work a little bit like an intensity based cap and trade system, using these intensity targets for both the fuel and the ship piece
Yeah,
of it.
so it's
So
a
that's kind of
combination of policy measures,
broad,
right? Because, like, on the one hand,
yeah,
it's a fuel standard, and that was staggered, right? So that was staggered over time, where, like, at the beginning, your emission had to come down by, like, 4%, 6%, 12%, and it goes on over time. So you know which benchmark you need to hit which year. And then on top of that, so if you're not hitting your benchmark, you then
yeah,
start trading allowances. Well, you start trading credits ultimately, right? So like you're almost imposing a penalty payment, but you're not calling it a penalty payment. You're making it a market-based measure. So overall, what do you think about the proposal?
yeah. And I think the idea behind So, I mean, I think it's a good start. There's definitely I do worry about intensity based markets versus total allowance based market, like total cap emissions, absolute emission based markets and stuff. Because we can, and both are useful, both are important, but it does allow, it is a little bit challenging with some of that sometimes. So, but it's a good start, I think. And more broadly, and I talked about this at the top, like global shipping emissions is only 3% of the
Mm,
market, but broad transportation emissions is like 20 to 25% of global emissions. And so by putting a framework in place that drives liquidity and technology into fuels broadly, I think is really valuable. That because that's one of the big, and there's a lot of challenges and conversations. And again, some of the countries that were very anti this beyond the US, countries like Saudi Arabia and stuff like that, were like, there's a fuels versus food conversation. Because obviously, as we use things like grain, like corn and stuff like
yeah.
that to create
How
fuel,
much area
what are
do we
people going
have
to eat?
available to
So there's
grow? Yeah.
exactly. So there's a legitimate kind of concern there. But like in terms of just like putting something in place that allows shipping companies to start planning around, I don't think is a bad start.
Hmm.
But there has been a lot sort of talked about in terms of, yeah, should we be thinking about absolute emissions versus intensity, particularly for the fuels piece, I think, in terms of what fuel goes into the ship, I think, because we're talking about a supply chain, using a carbon intensity, I think is fine. And I was talking to a friend yesterday who's very much in this space and an absolute kind of methodology expert. She had a lot of concerns about the absolute emissions on the tank to wake piece because by not doing absolute, it doesn't take how far the ship is going into consideration because it's just an
Yeah.
intensity. It's like the engine's going to burn like on an intensity basis, irrespective of the distance.
So you
And I think
can
that
use like a low carbon intensity fuel, go for a very long way, and
all
actually
around the
create
world,
more
right?
emissions. Yes.
Exactly.
So
And
overall
it
emissions
doesn't.
might still grow. The fuel we use will become cleaner, but then the efficiency gain may be lost because we travel more, the economy grows, and we have more goods that are being shipped.
So, and I think this is something we were talking as well. It's different in terms of how the EU, who have incorporated shipping as part of their
Yeah.
EU ETS, is looking at it. They're not doing intensity; they're doing more of an absolute kind of emission
You
number.
have a cap,
So
right? Like
there's
you have a
challenges
certain
there.
number of
Yeah.
allowances for each sector, and the cap decreases over time. So that cap doesn't look at the intensity of the fuel that was used. That cap looks at the total emissions that were produced. So, in theory, if you used the oldest, dirtiest vessel and you burned the most high carbon intensity fossil fuel, you could still remain within your allowance, right? And like somebody in like a new vessel on a clean fuel could exceed their allowance because they're looking at like totally globally, like what are the numbers of emissions. Um,
Exactly.
but Deb, like I want to
Yeah.
dig into something you said earlier, right? Isn't like you were excited about this because it basically would have created investments, would have incentivized investments into new fuels. Right. And like I think what you're saying there is like the way that this package was designed, right? So like intensity benchmark plus levy, it was going to incentivize fuel switching, right? And like I think that that really matters that like basically the way to push climate action or like emission lowering emissions in shipping, the idea was to look at the fuel, not the vessel. What are your
Yep.
thoughts on that?
Yeah. There was a really good piece put out, and we can link it in the show notes. There was a really good piece put out by Columbia's Center on Global Energy Policy, and they did it before the meeting. But they were talking about some of the gaps in this framework, and one is really around the cost basis on some of this. So a couple of different pieces in this, because the way the intensity targets have sort of been separated a little bit, is you've obviously got the fuel piece, and then you've got the like, what's the ship going to do itself, right? In terms of efficiency and stuff like that. The cost of building a new cargo ship is
Mm,
excessive, right? So like it's like at what point, and this article that Columbia put out talks about the fact that the penalties, even like particularly early on, the penalties for missing the carbon intensity cap does not incentivize shippers to build different types of
mm.
vessels and newer
And we've talked
vessels
about this before, right? Like
because
the
it's
penalty
just
needs to be high enough.
such a huge capitally intensive process.
Yeah, absolutely. So like fleet replacement, like there would not have been any fleet replacement of the global shipping fleet under this incentive because it's not high enough, right? And like this is also something we talk about in aviation a lot because aviation probably has very similar issues, right? As in like there isn't an easy way to globally govern aviation because it crosses international airspace. Airplanes aren't necessarily registered where they're going, and so on and so forth, right? And like you can always look at fleet and fleet efficiency, and you can look at fuel and feedstock inputs, right? And like those two things are different, right? And like most policies, like we're seeing the same, like we're seeing a very similar approach in aviation actually. Like most policies aim at the fuel, not the fleet. And like I sometimes think the thinking behind that is a little bit that like, the fleet will get replaced with time.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right in terms of like it's these sort of two pieces. And so the first, like I said, one of the big gaps that's been identified and that people have been talking about is like it's not necessarily going to incentivize different kinds of ships, new ships to be built, that kind of stuff. And so um it is a challenge with it, but at the same time it's that we'll put that piece sort of to the side for a bit. The second piece, and this is actually the bit that I'm more excited about, and I should say I'm not unbiased in it because it's an area I've spent a lot of time working on. But it's the fuels piece in terms of how do we think about and how do we incentivize and how do we even build carbon intensity as a metric as part of different fuels? Like when fuels sell and buy and trade and stuff like that, there's quality indicators that indicate price of fuels in terms of the density of them, impurities in them. The low sulfur fuel oil has been a huge conversation in this space where when there was rules put in place about the removal of sulfur from fuels, everyone was like, it's going to crater everything. It's going to cost too much. And it
Mm,
didn't. And I mean, some of that actually coincided with the fact the world shut down during COVID.
mhm.
So fuels, it sort of disrupted fuels pricing and stuff like that. But like, now we have sulfur metrics on fuel. And so, like, the idea of then now putting carbon intensity metrics on fuels, um, to me, is something it can start to actually allow people to, and I think it will start to play into price. One of the things that we were talking about previously, and it was stuff with like Bill Gates's comments around like how do we drive down green premiums, and one of his examples was around sustainable aviation fuel. This is no different, right? Sustainable aviation fuel is essentially a biofuel, a biojet fuel that can be used in place of traditional jet fuel. And it's much more expensive. And so, this idea of using methanol, using hydrogen, using biofuels, using biodiesels, or thinking about how the carbon intensity varies for a traditional fossil fuel. Because again, production is different, so it drives different behavior. The refining stuff isn't going to be that different, but it does matter how the refinery is configured in terms of what the emissions are for that supply chain.
Yeah.
So that's the piece of this I was actually quite excited about because, again, as we start thinking about from a transport fuel point of view, and it's stuff that the low carbon fuel standard in California kind of captures, although they allow varying carbon intensity for bio based fuels, but for fossil based fuels, they have a single number. And so it sort of doesn't do the whole spectrum, but I think it does start to allow people to make choices around what are they buying and are they willing to pay a premium, and if we can get enough liquidity into the market around emission reduction through the fuel supply chain, I think we'll see those premiums coming down. So I was really excited about this for that perspective. But I'm a little bit biased because I work in this space. So around that kind of piece. So
But ultimately, I was chatting with a friend who's in shipping. And ultimately, what she was saying is that, if you look at conventional fuels that are being used today versus green ammonia, which is one of the replacement fuels that we're looking at, it's something like 3x the price. So it's really like you're not necessarily going to have the margins just lying around to go into ammonia. So pretty much what I'm getting from the whole debate is like we're either looking at electric or we're looking at biofuels because all the other options, right? So like ammonia, hydrogen, methanol, like it's not viable or it's not viable at this point until somebody does something drastically different that's going to drive down cost for alternative fuels. Is that the direction? Is that what you're hearing? It's going to be electric or it's going to be bio?
I think it's the bio piece is I would agree. It's a challenge, and it is a challenge in terms of the cost piece, right? Like feedstocks are limited, and so that also, the price of feedstocks dictates the price of the fuels. So there is a long way to go. I would agree that that's kind of what we're hearing. I mean, with the exception, and I think you and I have laughed about this and looked at some of this before, but like there's a whole kind of conversation coming back in about like just sailing and using wind, and like
I
maybe we were
know.
doing
Can
this
we
right
put a
the first time
picture
around.
in? Like, they now have these giant ass cargo ships that have sails set up in the middle. Like, they're not tarp. Like, it's not what you expect of a sail. They're actually, like, I'm gonna say, like, metal or like some solid sort of structure at the center of the ship that can be pivoted into the wind. And, like, it's just so fascinating to me that this is what we're now doing with cargo ships, is that we're trying to catch some wind because it reduces fuel consumption because we finally realized that wind is free and fuel is not.
Yeah. So it's that pace, I think it's a very small margin of what we're talking about and stuff like that. But there is conversation around like, how do we leverage, the wind and again, it's challenging because then again, if there's no wind blowing, then the ships is stagnant. And so ships that have been kind of retrofitted with this kind of thing, for the most part, still do have fuel systems and they sail when they can. And then they use fuel when they
Oh,
when
they
they
do,
need to.
absolutely. I mean, these are not sailing ships. I mean, I think there's a few like gimmick sailing cargo ships, but like for the most part, we're talking about hybrid systems, right?
Yeah, exactly. But again, it's this conversation around cost, right? Because to build new ships, whether it's, retrofitting things is always much more expensive than building new, but the capital required to build new ships is really significant. So I think there is a conversation around it. Some of the conversation around wind powered ships as well is that they're not capable of carrying as much cargo, right? So when you talked about it at the top of how much we rely as a global economy on moving things around the world with ships because it's much more efficient than doing it with airplanes. Um,
It's cheaper.
is again like if we have to yeah, if we do move to things like, just using wind powered ships and stuff like that, the volume of cargo on the water would have to come down significantly, which I don't know that it will. So that's the fun piece in this space. It cracks me up that like maybe we're
Yeah,
doing
we
this right
did
the
it
first
right in
time,
the
but
1700s. We should just go back to where we were, for sure. I feel like there's a couple more things we
yeah,
should cover before we get off this conversation. I mean, one thing is like what happened in that room and why did it all fall down. The other thing that I love to pick your brain on was a completely different proposal. So like we had these like really complex negotiations. After years and years and years, they arrived at a conclusion. And then basically what happened in that room is that the US came in under a new administration, as we all know, and like traditionally they haven't weighed in very much at the IMO. But the US came in, they teamed up with the UAE, Saudi, and a bunch of oil producing nations, and they started rallying against this agreement, which was like a really long fought international consensus, right? So like the US started stirring sentiment, and like they had this
yeah,
ultimately they had this demand that they were putting towards the EU, right? So like the EU in their emissions trading system included international shipping emissions as of last year. That was a huge step that's been in discussion since at least since I was in school, right? So like at least for 15 years. Um so the EU included it. The UK will include shipping emissions into their trading system as of next year, as of 2026. And both of these systems were meant to be embedded in an international agreement where we all agree that we're going to have this deal, right? With this like global levy where you basically pay this penalty every time you exceed a target. So it all made sense. It was all aligned. It was something that everybody was pushing for. And so basically the US came in and they started pushing in the room for the EU to agree to exempt shipping again from the ETS where they'd already included it. And so basically, like, the bargaining chip was we will sign an agreement on an international carbon market for shipping if you drop shipping from the domestic trading system that you already have in place. So it became this like weird bargaining chip. At some point, I believe that the EU actually agreed to this to at least get the carbon intensity targets through. It still fell down. The whole agreement still came down. So like we have this entirely fraught international process that after years of negotiation has now come to a halt again. And frankly, like there isn't really a way forward, right? Like, I mean, looking left, right, and center, and like no commentator can find us a way out of this conundrum because, like, next year the US is still going to be opposed. Oil producing nations are still going to be opposed. So this isn't really going to come back from the looks of it right now. I was listening
Yeah.
to a talk and it kind of inspired me. So I was listening to Professor Dasgupta and he was speaking about, I mean, really, he was speaking about climate and nature, but it's really applicable, it's really applicable to this situation. Ultimately, he was saying if we're moving 2 trillion in value in shipped goods every year, he's like, why don't we do what we would do for road levies, right? He's like, why don't we impose a levy at port when your ship arrives, you pay a 5% levy on the value of your goods, and that levy goes into the International Oceans Fund, call it whatever you will, right? As in, like, it doesn't go to a single nation, it goes into a pooled investment fund for all those levies, and those levies then get invested in climate action for shipping. And I was like, I mean, obviously, like, there's no support for this idea, but it just like it gave me the stat where I was just like, well, that's actually potentially a pretty good way out of this conundrum, right? Isn't like let's step away
Yeah.
from trying to get 190 plus nations to agree on like carbon levies and carbon intensity targets, and let's actually like go the old school way and basically introduce tariffs on shipping.
Yeah. I was gonna say, like, it comes down to this kind of thing, right? Like, and I don't, to be honest, the way that the fund, the exceedings of the targets, and then the fund was kind of like framed as part of the IMO's net zero. It's not. It's sort of a little bit more detailed, but it's not that different from that kind of thing, right? Like, it's saying we're gonna put this cap in place. It would be varied. It wouldn't be a fixed levy. But then the irony, like, that's the US is using tariffs as a threat. Like, Trump essentially came out and said that anyone that agreed to this, the US would tariff. And so it's
Yes. Yes. So,
people
like,
are just
this whole, like,
getting,
agreement then got pulled into the trade war, right? Where Trump was just like he's still threatening the EU to
yeah,
put in retaliatory tariffs if the EU continues to include international shipping in the EU ETS. And I'm like, that's a
yeah.
climate policy, right? And it's like it's now turning into a trade war.
I mean, to be honest, the tariff thing broadly in the US has been a retaliatory thing. And it's not to do anything to do with emissions or anything like that. But I don't know if people saw it. But the Ottawa state government played an anti tariff ad using Reagan's, like, stuff that Reagan had said,
Yeah.
and played it at the World Series. And Trump got mad and
Yeah.
then started tariffing Canada again. Like, I'm like, this is ridiculous.
No, it's become very
The whole
personal, right? As in, like, Trump
Yeah,
is upset against
exactly.
a world leader, and it can be President Xi,
Mhm.
or it can be
And
Ursula von der Leyen, like,
I mean,
or it can be Mark Carney,
this
right?
was
And like, if Trump gets personally
it
upset,
wasn't
he
even Mark
uses
Carney.
a
He
global.
was mad at Ottawa.
Ottawa,
Like,
yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
like,
There we go. The Ottawa government, whoever is in charge in Ottawa right now, I don't know. But this was around a hockey match, I thought.
well, Ontario, whoever, like, whatever.
Ontario.
I get
Yeah,
my
there we
Canadian
go. We don't
provinces
even
mixed up.
know who's in charge of the province anymore. But yeah,
Like, it
so
doesn't.
like long
That's
story short,
the
Trump's going full on like personal feud with his
Yeah,
tariff policy,
yeah.
which no longer
And
makes
so
a
I
whole
think,
lot of sense.
yeah, at the end of the day, and it's kind of ironic, right? Where the US is like, no carbon taxes, right? Like, screw you, we don't want any carbon taxes. But then on the flip side, they're like, oh, we're quite happy to tariff you, which is just a tax. So it's like, it's quite hypocritical. And when you break it down into its simplest form, it's very hypocritical. So the thing that's going to be interesting, I think, because you said, like, again, what happened is that this negotiation has just been kicked down the road 12 months. Everything's on hold. And so nothing's going to happen. And it's just been kicked down the road. The thing I think is going to be interesting, given the shifting in global trade because of tariffs, um, and this conversation about, well, should we send things to the EU because they have methane intensity targets and shipping, emissions and stuff like that, and then you've got the US tariffing everybody and anybody for any reason and every reason, is that I do think we're going to start seeing a bit of a shift in global trade generally. And I think, after this Canadian backlash because of this ad, Mark Carney actually was interviewed and he was like we can't rely on the US as a trade partner anymore, and we're going to look to other trade partners. And so in 12 months' time, we might be in a different situation where the card that Trump played around, well, whoever votes for this, we're going to tariff it, maybe it won't matter anymore because actually the rest of the world will be like, we don't trade with you anymore, US. We trade with everybody else and we trade with each other. So, like, it'll be interesting to see if the tariff card has been overplayed and if that will lose its threat. Um, I think it could be a really interesting thing for us to look at because at the end of the day, we are talking about taxes in different forms, right?
Mhm.
The way the IMO proposed it is a tax on, breaking a target. If we did a levy, it would be a fixed tax. The tariffs are fixed taxes going the opposite way. So, like, it is all just about who's taxing who at the end of
Mm.
the day, based on trade. Um, and so, yeah, I think there's a lot to watch. And I'm not, like I said, I'm not I don't know what'll happen in 12 months' time, but we may see that the sentiment does shift a little bit, even though Trump will still be the president next year um, when this negotiation comes back up for discussion. So I don't know. It'll be interesting to see. So
Mm. I mean, I can't see, like, honestly, I can't see a world where we reduce, I mean, we will reduce trade dependencies, right? And, like, I do think that most countries or unions like the European Union are looking at reducing their trade dependencies and diversifying away from the US. It's just the US has been so central to the global economic trade system, but also so central in terms of currency independence. I don't see us entirely reducing this dependency, right? So, like, I think we'll be stuck in this situation for a while, but I think it's worth recapping, like, what the impacts are of not having this agreement in place, right? Because, like, we do know that, like, you were hoping for all of this innovation to happen in the biofuel space or the alternative fuel space, which is now unlikely to happen because there's no incentive to invest. Um, I think the other point, just looking at global emissions, is that you were saying this earlier, like shipping currently is 3% of global emissions. But if we don't start curbing the emissions intensity just with like global growth and like the growth of trade, this is expected to grow by at least 50% by 2050, right? So these emissions will continue to grow as the economy grows. Um, and I think that there's an element of human suffering, and like maybe to try and tie this back a little bit to like, the metrics that Bill Gates was talking about, where he said, the best metric is actually like, are we reducing human suffering? And like, I was talking about this with a commercial captain a while back, and it was so staggering to me how many cargo ships go down, and how many people actually drown, like seamen who work in shipping actually drown in cargo shipping accidents because these things are really old and they're badly maintained and there's not very good standards around it, right? And like there's entire fleets that sail where you're not entirely sure where they're coming from and where they're registered, right? But like just looking at numbers, like in the 1990s, we used to have something like 200 ships go down a year, right? And like those numbers are coming down, right? So like now we're closer to like 30. But I'm like, one of the things, just like to look at the human suffering behind this industry, like one of the things that the standard eventually could have brought about is a fleet renewal, right? And like I think that there's
mm,
so many impacts that are like there on climate, there on human lives, there on like economic development. But overall, I would say, the world is worse off without having this agreement in place.
yeah. And it's the other piece around this as well, and it's something that I don't think we ever talk about is that we ship a lot of trade, but we also ship a lot of waste.
Oh.
And actually, by putting a price on emissions, maybe we wouldn't stop. Maybe people would second guess or think twice about shipping waste, and actually, we would
Ah,
start
because your
dealing with
waste
waste
taxes will
equally
go up.
after. Yeah. Like,
That is so interesting. Yeah.
it's I don't know, it's an interesting kind of piece, right? Like, it's, we don't and again, particularly here in the US, we're very consumer driven and stuff like that, and we are quite happy to ship our waste somewhere else, and let someone else in the world deal with it, and which is kind of a sad thing, and it also then for the communities that are then taking our waste and our trash, it's devastating for them, right? So it's like, maybe if there was a higher cost on shipping, maybe some of that wouldn't happen as well. So um, lots to kind of take away from it. I
Yeah.
think it's going to slow down the market adoption of on the fuel side for sure, and the market metrics around that. It's gonna slow down the cost differential on fuels that we see, because there's no incentive for people to think about fuels, to a certain extent.
Yeah, and there's
And
so
yeah,
much
like
waste in shipping itself, right? Like, just thinking back to, like, again, like, news from the commercial captain where I'm like, we're talking about super yacht like, he used to captain super yachts, and, like, he was talking about the fact that, like, commercial is one thing, right? So, like, freight, tankers, cargo, like, that kinda thing, but, like, in super yachts, right? So, like, back to the super wealthy, um, they used to burn 4 tons of fuels a day in port. So just to run the ship's sort of like air conditioning, sound system, the kitchen, and the entertainment systems, that was 4 tons of fuel, And then like at sea, it's closer to 20. And I was just like, that to me is like so incredibly wasteful. Like I can't actually quite explain like how wasteful that is on a global scale if you think about the number of super yachts that are out there, right? And like I think the idea, and like I'm sure it's not that different from cargo ships that also do not like I mean these are very simple things, right? But like do you turn off the engine while in port while being loaded, right? Like do you actually need them to keep away from the dock, or are you just like running them because you might as well run them, right? Like I think that those are some of the efficiencies that like where shipping in and off itself becomes extremely wasteful.
yeah. So I think takeaways from this, like more to come. I think I don't, like, but it is unfortunate. I think that it didn't go through, and but it'll be interesting to see how the ongoing broad trade conversation impacts climate conversation, right, and vice versa. And a little bit, I've talked about how you know, energy policy is climate policy and climate policy is energy policy, but we're sort of seeing the same thing around trade. And like trade policy is starting to impact climate policy and definitely vice versa
Yeah.
because of this threat of tariffs and pricing and some of that kind of stuff.
Yeah,
So
certainly.
I don't think we've heard the last of it. It's going to be an interesting and an evolving conversation
I
for
think
sure.
you're more positive on this one than I am. I guess my closing thoughts would be like this agreement is well and truly dead. Right. And like I don't see it coming
Mm,
back under the current administration, but it'll be interesting to see
we'll see.
who's right next year. We can do a repeat of this
Yeah.
conversation.
I feel yeah, it'll be good. And I mean, to be honest, like a year feels like a lifetime right now as well. So that's the other piece in some of this is like some of this stuff is happening so quickly. Like the Trump administration has only been in place since January, like, and yet like January seems like a lifetime ago.
And yet
So
they've done so much
um
damage. And now they're talking about another term, right?
yeah, well, I
Yeah.
don't think that's gonna happen, but we'll see. Anyway. So yeah, it's anyway, we'll
Never
leave
say
it there.
never.
But no, always good to see you. And yeah, again, make sure you like and subscribe, and we will see you all soon.